Well, hey there, and welcome to episode 10 of B.Hooked TV. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'm your host, Brittany, and in today's episode, I want to share my top 3 tips for making yarn substitutions. These 3 things are pretty much non-negotiables, so you want to listen up if you ever want to substitute a yarn in an upcoming project. Now, before we get to it, if you haven't done so already, please, you know the drill, subscribe to the show so you can be the first to know that a new episode is published. By the way, I do that every single week. I'm here to help you get better at your craft week after week, and by subscribing, you'll never miss an episode. Now, I've said it once and I will say it again because it is so important. These 3 things are non-negotiables when it comes to making yarn substitutions. Learn from my mistakes. You want to follow these 3 things before you try to go and use a different yarn despite what your pattern says. Okay, tip number 1 is to stay within the same yarn weight category. Now, if you're totally brand new to crochet and you have no idea what I'm talking about, look at the back of your yarn label. You'll see a little drawing there of a little yarn ball, and it'll have a number there. That number is its yarn weight category. Now, most patterns aren't going to say use number 4 yarn. They're probably going to say something specific like use Red Heart Super Saver yarn or use Paint Box Simply Aran. Now, that one, the name actually does have a little tip there, but in most cases it's going to give you a specific yarn and you'll have to do a little investigating to figure out what yarn weight category it is. Luckily, we have the internet nowadays, and that makes it super easy. So what you'll do is just a quick Google search, type in the yarn that the pattern recommends, find that manufacturer's website, and then look at the description. Now, once you know what weight yarn the pattern is recommending, then that'll give you your guideline to figure out what yarn you can possibly substitute it with. Let's say you have something in your stash and you're wondering if it might be appropriate. So look at that label, find the yarn weight category. If the number matches, 99% of the time, you're going to be okay. You want to follow up with the other tips as well, but the other thing to consider is the slight variance within the yarn weight category. I know it can't just be easy, right? Some worsted weight yarns are a lot thinner than others. A really good example of this is Red Heart Unforgettable, which is a number 4, and then you compare that to Red Heart Super Saver, which is also a number 4. There's a difference between those 2 weights. One isn't really going to be a great substitute for the other, for this reason and for other reasons that we'll learn as we progress through these tips. So once you know the weight category that the pattern recommends, you have an idea of the yarn that you want to substitute, and let's say you're spot on right now. Your yarn weight category matches, they're pretty similar in weight. Now what? Well, this brings me into tip number 2. Make sure the texture is similar. One extreme example of this is a really fuzzy yarn, something that has a really low stitch definition, and something that's really smooth. And although the weight might be the same, the texture is completely different. Now, it's not a total deal breaker if you want to substitute a yarn that might be a little fuzzier for another one, but there's something you should keep in mind. What does the stitch pattern look like? Does it have a very clean or clear stitch definition? That basically means you can look at each one of the stitches and you can really distinguish one stitch from the other. Is there a really pretty stitch pattern? Maybe it's some lace work or some intricate stitches. Maybe the stitches create a texture all on their own. Textured yarns sort of do all of the work for you, while smooth yarns give you the freedom and flexibility to create the texture. So that's why these aren't really great for yarn substitutions. If your pattern is recommending a smooth yarn, you'll want to substitute with another smooth yarn so you'll get the same look and feel that the pattern shows in the photos. Now, you may have to do a little investigating here as well if the pattern calls for a yarn that you're not familiar with. You can do most of this looking online, but if you can get to your local store, that would be the best case scenario. So you can look at the yarn, you can feel it and touch it and see it for yourself and make that comparison side by side. Now, the caveat to all of this is making a substitution between a roving yarn and a plied yarn. One could argue that you could substitute one for the other and there would be no big deal. But in the instance where durability comes into play, that's where you really need to be careful about substituting one for the other, or specifically substituting a roving yarn where a plied yarn was called for. Now, roving yarn has a tendency to pill or fuzz as it gets repeated wear or rubbing or use or anything like that, and that can be a real deal breaker for a garment or something that's going to get a lot of use. Now, another thing that follows along with the texture is the fiber. So let's say your pattern calls for an acrylic yarn, but you prefer to use an animal fiber or a blended yarn. Can you safely make that substitution? Well, I'd say in most cases you're probably fine, but you want to be smart in that decision and just think about the project. Is it going to need a lot of washing, for example? You want to make sure you choose a yarn that has care instructions that are, that's pretty easy to care for, that you can throw it in the washer if you need to. Another thing to think about is the drape or the weight of that yarn. This is really important for garments. Think about a sweater. Acrylic yarn is really light, and let's say you crochet a sweater, and if the pattern was written specifically for, let's say, a lighter yarn and you used a heavier yarn, then that garment isn't going to lay the same as before. It's going to probably sag a little bit or droop, and the drape is just going to be different. Another common question might be substituting a cotton yarn for an acrylic or another animal fiber. And cotton yarn has a couple of different things that come into play. It is definitely a heavier yarn, so you'll have to factor that into it, but it also doesn't have very much stretch to it. Now, this is something I don't have to tell you if you've ever worked a project in cotton, but that will come into play for the sizing and the shaping, the overall fit of the project. Now, I know that's quite a bit for tip number 2. We covered texture there, so the look and feel of the yarn, what it is it a fuzzy yarn, is it a smooth yarn, but also about what the fiber is and how that comes into play with your yarn substitutions. Now this brings us right into tip number 3, look at the yarn label. This is so critically important. Now, you've already looked at the yarn label a couple times for the previous tips. Specifically for this one, we're looking for the yardage. A lot of patterns will say that you need 4 skeins of whatever yarn. Most skeins are not the same yardage. A lot of them might have a similar weight to them, but the yardage is different, and that's what's important for completing your project. So let's go back to your pattern. We'll look at the yarn that's recommended. It says 4 skeins of this yarn. We'll go ahead and look up that yarn once again and find how many yards are available in that skein. Then you'll go back to the yarn you want to substitute with and find the number of yards within that skein. So we have a couple pieces of information now. We know the total number of yards the project requires, and we have the total number of yards in one skein of the yarn you wish to substitute with. Now you'll just divide one by the other. You'll divide the number of yards in your skein into the total number of yards for that project. That'll give you the total number of skeins you need to complete your project in your substituted yarn. Okay, so let's recap here. Non-negotiable major tip number 1, stay within the same weight category and take it one step further and make sure that they're close enough in weight that you can make the substitution without affecting your gauge. Non-negotiable and important tip number 2, make sure the texture is similar. This factors in the feel of it, so is it fuzzy or smooth? It also factors in the fiber. Is it acrylic, animal fiber, some kind of blend, cotton? Again, this is going to factor in your gauge, but it's also important for the drape. And non-negotiable tip number 3, look at the yarn label and make sure you're factoring in the yardage. You need to have the same number of yards for your substituted yarn, not necessarily the same number of skeins that it calls for. Now I say all of these things and they're non-negotiable and they're super important because nobody wants to get to the end of a project and realize that things didn't work out. When you find a pattern that you love it because of what you see in the photos, right? But when you make a yarn substitution, and maybe it's not the right yarn substitution, you might end up with a project that looks completely different. So if you take a few steps before you get to that point, so you're making your best educated guess on what that substitution is, you'll be so much happier in the long run. Now, I would love to know, what are your questions as it relates to yarn substitutions? If you have a specific question that we haven't covered here, leave that in the comment section below, and I would love to expand on this more in the future. All right, that'll wrap up this week's episode of B.Hooked TV. Thank you so much for your time and attention. I appreciate you, and I look forward to helping you get better at your craft in next week's episode. I'll see you there.